All right. We are back in the book of Ezekiel. I know. We need to get started, people. There's a basketball game at 1 o'clock here. And my wife, I'll tell you this, because we're not really started class yet. My wife has a chance to be the champion of our March Madness pool that we do with like hundreds of people from back home in Atlanta. This guy puts it together. Well, it's donated, but it is going to be a gift card if she wins, you know. But Beth is in first place, and she needs Miami to beat Kansas, which I'm not too optimistic about, but if that happens, then she's got a great chance of winning first place. So let's get through class so we can get home and watch the game. That's what Ian was talking about today, right? Oh, wait, sorry. Okay, you got handouts now that we've done that part of it. Let's do a review. So notice most of the first page is a review. You can be filling that out. That's going to be the first of our objectives today, is to review the first 7 chapters and remember some highlights, some summaries by matching them with their respective chapters. So be working on that. That's on your handout. That's under the section review on the front side. It has the chart on there as well as the matching. We'll also talk about the abominations in the temple this morning and a crime worse than the abomination. So this is what the review looks like. If you're at home watching this, you can see it on your screen and work on it, or these handouts are all available on the website as well under Bible class materials. So take a few minutes to work without looking at your Bible and see how we're doing on them. Let's start with the review of the book of Ezekiel. And remember, these 3 boxes on top are about the events taking place in Jerusalem. And Ezekiel is actually fairly unique in the way that the book is structured, that there is not only a chronology of these oracles, but the oracles are often tied to a historical event that's taking place in Jerusalem, back at the ranch, we might say, while Ezekiel is in exile in Babylon. So what's the event that kind of doesn't happen at the beginning of the book, but it's made reference to and really, dictates the tone of the first part of the book? Yeah, exile, you got to start with the same letter. They all start with B, right? So, bowed down is the idea. So yes, the event referred to in the beginning of the first chapter is the exile of King Jehoiachin. It was also when Ezekiel himself was taken exile. And the book is, we're beginning a few years after that, in the 5th year of Jehoiachin's exile. But it reminds us that Jerusalem has already been bowed low. They have already been captured by the Babylonians and a bunch of people taken away out of the city. So the first part of the book is what? First 24 chapters. We're going down now. Sorry, I should explain. So now on the bottom chart, the first section of the book is judgment on Jerusalem. Okay. Now we're going to go back up at about chapter 25, 24, 25. There's another historical marker. And what happens to Jerusalem? It's besieged. Okay. And we'll talk about why that's relevant in a second. And then at that point, for whatever reason, Ezekiel changes the topic of the writing, and the next several chapters have to do with what? Judgment on the nations, okay? And then we get the big announcement in chapter 33 that what has happened to Jerusalem? Broken or totally destroyed, temple torn down, burned, everybody else taken exile, total desolation. That's the big event. And then for the rest of the book, from 33 to 48, what is there in Ezekiel's message for Israel? Hope, okay? And that finishes off the book, all right? So let's look at what we've seen so far. Oh, by the way, this will be especially, we'll see this in chapters 8 through 11, the section that we're in now is today and then into Sunday and next Wednesday. The theme of the early section of the book is God's absence, okay, from his people, leaving his people, not being with his people. The theme of the hopeful part of the book will be the temple of God that Ezekiel mentions, or that he envisions, and the Lord is there. In a similar way of saying that, we're going to see in a couple chapters the glory of the Lord departing from the temple in Jerusalem, and then in the end of the book, the glory of the Lord will come on this envisioned temple in the New Jerusalem that Ezekiel sees in the last several chapters of the book. Okay, so let's go through these. Chapter 1, which one is it? D, yes. I think Ezekiel sees the likeness of the glory of God. Then in chapters 2 and 3, Alf, thank you, Ian. Ezekiel is called by God as the watchman of Israel. That's his call as a prophet. Chapter 4, E, the model of the siege. Remember, that's why the history is important. We're still years away, several years away from Jerusalem actually being besieged. The people would have thought, that's not going to happen. God will take care of things before it gets to that point. But Ezekiel's model of the siege is a look ahead to, no, this is really what's going to happen to the city back in Jerusalem. Okay, chapters 5 and 6. C, the sword. Some of these chapters of judgment, it's a little bit hard to distinguish, what separates one from the other. But the classes that Rick taught for us, the image of the sword shows up over and over again. Remember, the sword, literally, Ezekiel used it to shave his head and his beard and then cut up the hairs. The idea was that was the sword of God's judgment, but it was going to look different. Some people would, there'd be fire, there'd be plague and famine and scattering to the winds. But all of that kind of falls under the umbrella of the sword of God's judgment. And then chapter 7 from Wednesday, remember the total devastation of economy, religion, government in Judah. So we move on to chapter 8. As we've been doing, let's read all of chapter 8. And then I'm excited about the discussion question that we're going to kick around when we're done reading. But let's read the 18 verses here that make up Ezekiel chapter 8. It came about in the 6th year, on the 5th day of the 6th month, as I was sitting in my house with the elders of Judah sitting before me, that the hand of the Lord God fell on me there. Then I looked, and behold, a likeness as the appearance of a man. From his loins and downward there was the appearance of fire, and from his loins and upward the appearance of brightness, like the appearance of glowing metal. He stretched out the form of a hand and caught me by a lock of my head, and the Spirit lifted me up between earth and heaven and brought me in the visions of God to Jerusalem, to the entrance of the north gate of the inner court, where the seat of the idol of jealousy, which provokes to jealousy, was located. And behold, the glory of the God of Israel was there, like the appearance which I saw in the plain. Verse 5, Then he said to me, Son of man, raise your eyes towards the north. So I raised my eyes toward the north, and behold, to the north of the altar gate was this idol of jealousy at the entrance. Then he said to me, Son of man, do you see what they are doing? The great abominations which the house of Israel are committing here, so that I would be far from my sanctuary? But yet you will see still greater abominations. Then he brought me to the entrance of the court, and when I looked, behold, a hole in the wall. He said to me, Son of man, now dig through the wall. So I dug through the wall, and behold, an entrance. And he said to me, Go in and see the wicked abominations that they are committing here. So I entered and looked, and behold, every form of creeping things and beasts and detestable things, with all the idols of the house of Israel, were carved on the wall all around. Standing in front of them were 70 elders of the house of Israel, with Jazaniah, the son of Shaphan, standing among them, each man with his censer in his hand, and the fragrance of the cloud of incense rising. Then he said to me, Son of man, do you see what the elders of the house of Israel are committing in the dark, each man in the room of his carved images? For they say, The Lord does not see us. The Lord has forsaken the land. Then he said to me, Yet you will see still greater abominations, which they are committing. Verse 14, Then he brought me to the entrance of the gate of the Lord's house, which was toward the north, and behold, women were sitting there weeping for Tammuz. He said to me, Do you see this, son of man? yet you will see still greater abominations than these. Then he brought me into the inner court of the Lord's house, and behold, at the entrance to the north of the temple, the entrance of the temple of the Lord, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men with their backs to the temple of the Lord, and their faces toward the east, and they were prostrating themselves eastward toward the sun. He said to me, "Do you see this, son of man? Is it too light a thing for the house of Judah to commit the abominations which they have committed here, that they have filled the land with violence and provoked me repeatedly? For behold, they are putting the twig to their nose. Therefore I indeed will deal in wrath. My eye will have no pity, nor will I spare. And though they cry in my ears with a loud voice, yet I will not listen to them." Okay, here's a question I want you guys to discuss amongst yourselves, and then we'll share out in a minute or two. How could this have happened? That's really the question. Ezekiel is seeing 4 different forms of idolatrous pagan worship in the actual temple complex of Jehovah. How in the world have we gotten to this point? And I want you to try to maybe get in the head of the people of Judah in their shoes to answer that question. How could they have gotten to this point of worshiping idols in the temple? Talk about that amongst yourselves, and we'll share out in a minute or two. Yeah. You got the mic.
Well, Mike and I were talking about, I was first just remembering Solomon and how he was not supposed to take foreign wives, and he did, and that pulled his heart away from God toward idols, toward false gods, and kind of thinking, I'm sure he wasn't the first, if we go back in Israel's history, it's happened with other leaders, but I was just remembering that. And then, it seems like it's gone downhill since then. But then Mike was like, yeah, well, it went up and down, right? And then we remembered Josiah, the last good king. And what happened with Josiah? They found the book of the law that nobody knew about, and nobody knew what was in it. And when it was read to Josiah, he was like, whoa, this is horrible. What are we doing? We're not doing what this says. And so, that's what has just repeated over and over again. It's just this, they get back on track, from time to time, but then there's the falling away, the forgetting, and as was said last week, the not reteaching from, to their children, so then they've come back to these idols, the idols of the world, or those nations around them creep in.
Okay, thank you, Michael and Mike. A long history, they point out, of falling away and forgetting, 2 of the words. So Mike, and then I think Brian can be geared up next.
Well, as we discussed, it was, like you said, eating that elephant one bite at a time. They didn't just suddenly wake up one morning and go, boom, we're going to do all this. So it was just the progression of falling away, falling a little bit further away. I sincerely think they probably didn't even know what was going on. It was just an accumulation over time. Plus, I can see them simply making the argument, we're just trying to assimilate with the people around us. We're God's people. We know we're God's people, but, these are good people we're living with, and we're just trying to adapt to them some to make them feel more comfortable, and same stuff we do nowadays, So it was, those 2 things were the main points. Of course, Jordan's got about 4 or 5 more, so I'm sure he'll hit those.
Thank you, Mike, and Mike's group. Brian?
Well, just in the word, I think you already said it. The Israelites, the Judeans, had forgotten God. They just let him slip away. It kind of goes back to you in 1 John. Do not love the world or the things of this world. And they got distracted by the things of this world and just let God out of their life, forgetting. And they were further thinking that God had forgotten them.
Thank you, Brian. The forgetting 2 directions, or at least the idea of forgetting 2 directions, see that. They've forgotten God, and yet they think that God's forgotten them. Maybe we'll see that in a little bit in the text as well. I think both of these things fit together. I mean, as Mike said, not only is it's so, the other image, the frog in the boiling pot, right? Sometimes it can be so slow and progressive that when you're actually in the moment, you're like, no big deal, it's what we've been doing, or something like that. But there also does seem to be a sense of God's forgotten about us, and so, this is what we're going to do as a response to that. Right. And that's what I'm thinking that with this question. You kind of have two parts of it. One, you have that, like, how did it happen in terms of the, historical realities? And that's what we've been talking about. It's slow, gradual. This is how it's happened. But how did it happen in terms of how would they ever justify this? Then I think you start bringing in some of these other things like, well, they would say, well, God's forgotten about us, or we're just trying to adapt to the religions around us, or something like that. Other thoughts on that? Yeah, Ian?
Yeah, I think it all, at the root of it, I think it all stems from selfishness. It's a lack of people willing to teach the truth. It starts with the leadership, the leaders within the nation of Israel, and then kind of flows down from there. As I was discussing with Mike and Robert, if the elders of the leadership aren't doing their job in teaching, it still falls on the quote-unquote older generation to teach the younger generation the truth, and not just blindly follow what a leader is doing, to know the truth and to teach that to your family and to your children's children and so on and so forth. But I believe we fall into this trap too, where what's happening in the world, what's happening in our everyday lives takes precedence over learning and teaching the Word of God, not just to ourselves, but to the younger generations, and making that a priority in our life. And that's the lesson I see here, is like, you've got to constantly be learning and teaching and learning and teaching, and make that a priority in your life before anything else that's going on in the world. Otherwise, you end up like that. It may take 200, 300 years for you to get to where they are, but eventually you will if you deprioritize teaching and learning the Word.
Thank you, Ian. And the idea of the elders, that's the focus of one of these abominations here, the elders in the temple. And multiple, I didn't necessarily expect that, but I liked that y'all talked about that. The teaching, the responsibility of teaching, that really fell on a lot of people, starting at home, of course, Deuteronomy 6, and then to others as well, the priests, the Levites, the elders. That clearly has failed in Israel and allowed them to get to this point. Okay, let's go through these verses in chapter 8, and y'all can speak up along the way if you have other things to contribute or ask about. Maybe to remind ourselves, I'm not going to keep showing this, so we can't come back to it. Here's the basic diagram of Solomon's temple, okay? Remember, there's kind of an outer area where people would gather, but then there's an inner courtyard as well, and then there's the sanctuary, the holy place, the most holy place. I don't pick up on others seeing a lot of rhyme or reason to Ezekiel's journey into the temple. He's not really going from the outermost into the innermost or anything like that. He's kind of hopping around here, but just to remember where that, and this north gate here, if I can, that's where he would have started out or entered in at the beginning, and then he digs in at some point into the inner sanctuary to see what's on the inside. Just remember what that would have looked like. Okay, let's look at this first section in which Ezekiel travels to the temple. Remember, these are marked in chronological order, and so there's something, I think, to be said for when these things are happening. So, back in chapter 1, we had the vision of Ezekiel taking place in the 5th year and in the 5th month. And so this is the 6th year and the 6th month. So 13, 14, it says the 4th month in verse 1 of Ezekiel 1. So if you go with 4th month, that would be 14 months after the call that Ezekiel sees this vision, and while he's sitting in his house. Now, see what we remember. After Ezekiel was called, assuming these things all happened kind of consecutively and pretty quickly, what was the first thing he was asked to do after his call? Lay down on his side. And how long was he supposed to do that, Rick? Yeah, 430 days total. So, again, assuming that all this is kind of happening at the same time, this vision takes place during the amount of time that he is lying on the other side. Now I'm going to get him confused. I think the right side. facing south, we would say, to represent bearing the iniquity of Judah. Remember, it was like 390 days on one side to represent Israel, the northern kingdom, and then 40 days on the other side to represent the iniquity of Judah. And I think that makes sense. First of all, this helps us to see that it wasn't a continuous 24/7 lying on his side. Okay, he was just doing it every day. And so now he's back in his house during this time where he's been telling people or bearing iniquity of Judah. Fits that at this time he's seen the vision of the iniquity in Judah, in Jerusalem. There's an interesting note that in verse 1, Ezekiel's in his house, and the elders, again, that would be the elders of the Judeans in exile, the elders are sitting before him in his house. Anybody want to guess why? What would the elders of Israel or elders of Judah be doing in Ezekiel's house, sitting before him? Maybe they come to tell him to quit preaching. What would be some other possibilities? It doesn't tell us, so we can speculate. Explanation for his behavior, Jamie says, asking him, hey, what's going on, right? We will learn, we'll see this a couple more times and learn that the elders do come to Ezekiel in other places to inquire, to find a word from the Lord. In our heads, and we should have in our heads, that what's going to be the end result of the people's reception of Ezekiel? What's the end result that we already know, that Ezekiel already knows? They're not going to listen. But that doesn't mean that along the way they might show some, signs of maybe taking Ezekiel more seriously. Think about it, 14 months, maybe when Ezekiel started, they thought, no, remember, this is a short-term thing. We're going to go home soon. Things are going to work out between Judah and Babylon, and we'll return to Jerusalem in no time. Well, 14 months go by, nothing's really changed, and Ezekiel's just been, preaching the same message. Maybe they are starting to take him a little more seriously and say, hey, what's going on here, okay? Or at least as Jamie says, okay, all right, we give up. You've been laying down on your side, silent, for a year and change. All right, just tell us what's going on here. Why are you doing this, okay? But it's interestingly, in the midst of this, the elders sitting before him, that Ezekiel sees a vision. There's a man that shows up. Remember the man described in chapter 1, the man-like appearance of the one sitting on the throne in chapter 1. There's a very similar description given here. So is this a vision, again, of God showing to transport him, or is this kind of a heavenly messenger that has a similar, indescribable, bright, glowing appearance? I don't think it really matters. But he is transported to the temple from Babylon. I think we're seeing here not an actual transportation. This is a vision. So I don't know if it hurt or not in the vision when he was grabbed by his hair and yanked up into the sky. I don't know. Anybody ever experienced pain in dreams? Like you break an arm in your dream? I don't know. But he's transported to the temple. All right. What he sees there is this. He sees first an idol of jealousy, some idolatrous image of some sort, and it's not exactly clear what it is. It doesn't say, but it is an idol. You probably can understand or appreciate the significance of calling it the idol of jealousy, because what does God frequently say about himself in regards to the people's worshiping of idols? He's a jealous God. And them setting up idols, really anywhere, of course, but especially in the temple, and this imagery will come back up in the book of Ezekiel, is like them being unfaithful as his bride and having other lovers right there in his house, of all things. And so he is jealous about that, and he calls this the idol of jealousy. Again, this is maybe something when you read chapter 8, I don't know how you reacted upon first reading it, but you think, surely not, right? Did they really have idols in the temple? Well, 2 Kings 21, and there may be other references as well, but at least this one, 2 Kings 21, says that they did. Manasseh, you may remember him as the worst of the kings. Really he's the son of Hezekiah, and after Manasseh, it's like, okay, that's it, right? Now the exile is certain, God says, because of their wickedness. And 2 Kings 21 verse 5 talks about the images of heavenly hosts being brought into the temple of all places. So yes, this was a historical practice that was done. Although, let's get our history again before us. What did Michael say earlier? Who happens to come along after Manasseh? And what did Josiah do? He cleaned house, literally, right? And all the idols were removed. So what does that mean if Ezekiel's now seeing the idols in the temple? They went back, right? For all the success, we might say, this was Mike and Mike's point from earlier, is that for all the success of Josiah in reforming, it was just a little bit of a bump up with another, decline afterward. You might say something like, for leadership, in Josiah's case, you can reform people's actions, but you can't reform people's hearts. And so they're going to go back to worshiping the idols after Josiah had cleaned them out. And so they're back in the temple. Justin, you going to say something about that?
A little literal observation of that means they're physically there, or is this more of an interpretive?
That's a good question. I'm going to say both to some degree. I think that Ezekiel seeing all these things means that these things were really going on in the temple. Now, is he literally seeing, if he had a video camera of what was going on in that moment in the temple? I don't necessarily think so. I think he's kind of just seeing the kinds of things that are happening, but they are things that are happening in the temple. Does that make sense? Okay, and by the way, Justin, I would be more inclined to think it's just representative if it weren't for verses like 2 Kings 21:5 that says, no, they actually did this. The more wicked kings in Judah did set up idols in the temple. And there's also archaeological evidence, by the way, in Israel of some of these high places where there's images or inscriptions that include both the Jehovah and some idol of the Canaanites, in the same little place, same sanctuary, same altar. And so there's historical evidence of that kind of. The fancy word is syncretism. That's the blending of different religions. Mike actually pointed this out earlier. It's a very popular thing even now, right? The blending of different religions together, and that's what they were doing in Israel. Okay, any questions or comments on this first abomination? Pick up the pace a little bit here. All right, so he sees the idol of jealousy, and then he's told, that's in the courtyard, he's told to go into the sanctuary. So dig through the wall into the sanctuary, and it's here that he sees a more shocking, that's the theme, you've seen that. It's I'm going to show you something even more shocking. Abomination still worse. So this one now, the wall of the sanctuary, the temple, covered with the idolatrous images of animals, right? You're familiar with the animal images in paganism, okay? And 70 elders, we mentioned the elders earlier, 70 elders of Judah are worshiping these images. It's as if each one has his own little space with his own little idol that he's worshiping there in the temple sanctuary. And among them, a guy named Jazaniah, the son of Shaphan. I gave you more verses on your worksheet. You can look at it later if you're curious. This is a family that actually we mentioned several times in the book of Jeremiah. He has a father, Shaphan is his name, who was the scribe that assisted with the event Michael described earlier when Josiah cleaned out the temple. So a faithful man who was an assistant of Josiah's, that's Shaphan. And then Shaphan had other sons and grandsons, according to the book of Jeremiah, that were also righteous in a wicked time. But Jazaniah, who you might expect to also be righteous, being from a righteous family, is in the middle of this idolatrous worship, perhaps showing again how far they have fallen if someone like him would be involved in this worship. And then this goes, verse 12 gets us back to our question from earlier. They say, so this gets to their rationale in verse 12. They say in the midst of worshiping these idols in the dark, right, in the inside of the sanctuary, thinking this being done in secret, they say the Lord does not see us and the Lord has forsaken the land. So one question is, do they think that the Lord cannot see? Do they think they're really hiding it from God, right? Like maybe Jonah thought he was really going to escape from God. Is it that, or have they decided or concluded that, you know what, God's given up on us. Therefore, he's not going to see. He's not going to care. he's forsaken our land. This gets back to what we were talking about earlier, the rationale from earlier. And I think especially if you remember that for the ancients, the worshiping of gods, it was putting your trust in that God to do something for you, okay? So like in the story of Elijah, right, where it doesn't rain. Because Baal was the god of the storms, and so the practice was, we really want it to rain this year so we could have good crops. So we, pay our dues to Baal, and he's going to deliver by giving us rain in their seasons, okay? And so you can imagine a situation in which things have gotten progressively worse and worse politically in Judah, their enemies, pressing in on them. Jehovah really doesn't seem to be acting on their behalf. And so maybe some other gods, maybe if we worship the Baals or the Asherahs or, these other gods we'll see reference to, or the sun or something, then we will find deliverance from them. Jehovah's given up on us, and so we turn to other gods as well. What would be the answer to that if you're going to provide a counter argument? Yeah, Rick? So has God forsaken the people? What has happened? Yeah, the people have forsaken him, okay? And as Rick said, they've been told, come back, come back, come back, come back. And they haven't. And so they can say, well, Jehovah's not going to do anything about it. In a sense, they're right, but it's not because he's not faithful to the covenant or doesn't love them. It's because he's handing them over to the consequence of their sin. But they think, well, that's hopeless, so let's put our trust in other things, okay? Sure. Yeah.
He sends his children.
That's right. Albert? Go for it, yeah.
Elders, because I just can't help but the people are in distress, they're panicking, they're going to the infrastructure of what God had created as the leaders, and they are just crumbling, and they're submitting more and more to the people's demands. I think of the golden calf when Moses was away, and they just, okay, let's make a golden calf. So it just, the pressure that is on our leadership to stay with God's word, to stay with God's plan, we really need to be mindful of that with our elders and supporting them and praying for them and giving thanks that we do vet out these men that serve us.
Thank you, Albert. In some ways, it's the inverse of the point that Ian was making. So we see in this passage a responsibility on leaders to lead well, but also you see the responsibility of people to, move public opinion, you might say, in a positive way or something. Okay. All right, let's finish out here. Hopefully these won't get too skewed with the title being messed up. The third abomination, I'll just real quick give it to you, is the women weeping for Tammuz. Tammuz is a Babylonian god. That's striking, isn't it? I mean, I thought the Babylonians were like the ones that they were in conflict with. And yet, I don't know, maybe worshiping a Babylonian god will help them in some way, in their way of thinking. But there's a ritual with Tammuz. There's some kind of story about, dying, seasonal kind of thing where the god would go away or die, and then you weep for them. They come back and bring the rains and stuff. And so here they are in the temple weeping for Tammuz, this Babylonian god. And then he sees 25 men in the temple courtyard, is the fourth abomination here. Backs to the temple of God, and they're facing the east. Remember from our diagram, the entrance is, to the east. And so that's where they're standing and facing out to the east. Their backs to the temple. And they are bowing down and worshiping the sun. Again, I didn't put it on there, but I put it on your handout, I think. Specifically, it said about Manasseh that he had idols built in the temple for the hosts of heaven, which would be like the heavenly bodies, so the worship of the sun, moon, and the stars. And so that's what these people are doing. They're worshiping the sun. And then, and we're about out of time here, but this was one of our objectives here. An interesting statement, almost like sneaks it in there before the end of the chapter. You don't have a chance to really process it. But in verse 17, God says, so they've seen an idol of jealousy. He's seen idolatrous images carved on the inside, 70 elders worshiping. He's seen women weeping for a Babylonian god. He's seen men bowing down to the sun in the temple courtyard. On top of all of that, he says, verse 17, is it too light a thing for the house of Judah to commit abominations which they have committed here, that they have filled the land with violence and provoked me repeatedly? For behold, they are putting the twig to the nose. By the way, no one knows what that phrase means, so don't ask. Okay, there are some clever, not necessarily share in a Bible class kind of answers that people have come up with, but none of them are very certain. But the point here seems to be that on top of the idol worship, what really provokes God the most is the violence and the injustice in the land. That's all over the prophets, okay? Think about Isaiah 1, right? I'm not going to hear your prayers. I'm not going to hear your worship. Why? Because your hands are covered in blood. Violence, oppression in the land. And that's the thing that the prophets talk about over and over again, that God is disgusted with, okay? But keep all this in mind as we head into chapters 9, 10, and 11, okay? Because we're going to see God's response to this. But at chapter 8, I think, among other things, shows us if there was any doubt or any question about whether the people deserved the judgment that God keeps saying is coming, chapter 8, I think, closes the door on that question. And so what we'll see is God's response in judgment and in departure from the people. So let's see how we did with this. I think you guys did well with the matching of the chapters for our first objective. Can you give me 2 of the abominations? Maybe you can give me all 4. I don't know. Weeping for Tammuz in the temple. Worshiping the sun. Yeah, idol in the temple and the beast carved on the wall. Yeah. And then what's the crime worse than idolatry that Ezekiel? All those things are, what's the crime worse? Violence in the land. Okay. Good job, and we quit early.